Good morning, everyone. We'll just give everyone a chance to log into the Zoom. Chief Justice, Valley Speaks, David, Chris and Erin, FLAC staff and colleagues, welcome to the launch of Remote Justice, FLAC's 2020 annual report. I would like to welcome in particular our colleagues in the statutory sector, Philip O'Leary and Angela Denning, and the pro bono associates, Ethna Lynch and Caroline Minnick, who played a stormer during COVID, helping FLAC out. The annual report is usually a great chance to catch up with the people we work with, and it's hard to believe that this is our second remote launch of an annual report. It would be so much nicer to meet you in person than talking to myself on the screen, and it seems particularly inappropriate not to be with the staff whose work is the subject matter of this report. The running order is I'll introduce FLAC's new chairperson, David Fennelly, who will introduce the Chief Justice, who will launch the report. Then I, Chris Bowes and Erin Brogan will provide more detail on the work of FLAC during 2020. And lastly, we are really lucky and I'm excited that poet, performer, playwright Valley Speaks will close the event. The crucial work of FLAC Council is largely hidden and goes unacknowledged and unthanked. And I'd like to give a very sincere thanks to FLAC Council for their ongoing support during such a turbulent and troubled year. 2020 was Peter Ward's last full year as chairperson. He's been an outstanding champion and chairperson of FLAC for years. He has strived and succeeded in guiding FLAC's development from a fledgling student organisation to a respected and trusted NGO with full-time staff and its own premises, creating a secure base for an alternative legal world and enabling FLAC to be able to focus front and centre on its quest for access to justice. He's also been a driving force in numerous campaigns and referenda that have transformed Ireland into the modern, inclusive society we have now. FLAC owes him a huge debt of gratitude for his unstinting loyalty, energy, commitment and vision. And he's been a pleasure to work with and a very supportive chairperson. And anyone who knows him knows that he makes people laugh like no one else I know, enlivening many council meetings. When things return to normal, we'll have to thank him properly in person and at an appropriate event. Peter was finally able to step down when our new chairperson, David Fennelly, somewhat reluctantly stepped up after what I prefer to call some very gentle persuasion, though I think David might describe it somewhat differently. He's an assistant professor in law at Trinity and a practicing barrister specialising in public law, EU, human rights and equality. He first became involved with FLAC as a student and has volunteered at FLAC clinics for many years. He joined FLAC Council in March. While he was appointed chair over 2 months ago, it was only announced last week, causing a very positive social media storm, which I think surprised David more than anyone else, confirming not that it was needed, what an excellent and popular appointment this is. David.
Thanks very much, Eilish, and good morning, everybody, and thanks again for attending the launch of FLAC's annual report for 2020. Quite the year it has been, and it's a year when the contribution of FLAC volunteers and staff and all of FLAC supporters has really come to the fore like never before. Before introducing the Chief Justice, we on FLAC Council want to express our deep appreciation for the work of all FLAC volunteers who've given so generously of their time, professional skills and expertise over the past year to promote access to justice. Every year, all around the country, hundreds of lawyers volunteer at FLAC clinics. And over the past year in particular, we owe a special debt of gratitude to those lawyers who at the start of the pandemic immediately offered their assistance so that we could move from the face-to-face clinics to the phone advice clinics. And we're also indebted to the volunteer lawyers who do crucial work supporting FLAC's casework, supporting PILA's pro bono register, as well as the members of FLAC student societies and the volunteers in the FLAC office. Without the contribution of our volunteers, FLAC simply would not be able to do its important work in promoting access to justice. And indeed, the same must be said of FLAC staff. And over the past year again, each and every member of the staff has been fantastic in responding to the challenges presented by the pandemic and the increased demand across so many of FLAC services. We pay particular credit to the phone line team, who within a few short weeks after the emergence of the pandemic, we're in the position to set up the phone advice clinics to replace the face-to-face clinics, and also the team which ensured the smooth transition to remote working and then the transition back to the office in more recent times. And last but not least, special thanks are due to Eilish Barry for her leadership and tireless work and commitment over the past year. We're also deeply grateful to all of our supporters and funders who have demonstrated their commitment to access to justice. This includes philanthropic organisations which provide key funding to FLAC, the government, statutory bodies such as the Citizens Information Board, as well as the legal profession, whether through the Law Society, the Bar Council, or the valuable contributions of individual firms and members of the profession. And over the past year in particular, the Department of Justice and the Law Society have facilitated increases in funding which have ensured that FLAC has been able to maintain and develop its services during a particularly challenging period. And we are also grateful for the support of the COVID-19 Stability Fund in this regard. Finally, this year, in terms of thanks and appreciation, cannot conclude without echoing and expressing my own thanks to my predecessor, Peter Ward. As Eilish has said, Peter has made a huge and lasting contribution to FLAC over decades, including in recent years as an outstanding chair. Anyone familiar with the organisation knows that FLAC would not be what it is today without Peter's contribution. And in the short time we have today, we can't do justice to that contribution. But as Eilish has said, we hope to pay proper tribute to Peter in the coming months when circumstances permit. Last but not least, I'm delighted to welcome our distinguished guest who has so kindly agreed to launch the annual report this year, Chief Justice, Mr. Justice Frank Clarke. After a distinguished career at the bar and on the bench, Mr. Justice Clarke was appointed the 12th Chief Justice of Ireland in July 2017. And he needs no introduction to this audience. We're delighted to welcome him back as a great friend of FLAC over many years. But it's no exaggeration to say that the Chief Justice has made access to justice a central focus of his tenure. In his statement for the new legal year in 2017, the Chief Justice identified access to justice as an area of high priority. In May 2019, he delivered the excellent opening address at FLAC's Access to Justice conference, which formed part of our 50th anniversary celebrations. And more recently, the Chief Justice has taken the initiative of establishing an Access to Justice Committee, which brings together key stakeholders and which FLAC has been delighted to participate in. And we at FLAC are really hopeful that this initiative will contribute to a renewed focus on access to justice in the legal system. As we embark on a period of significant reform and modernisation of the court system, it is more important than ever that we consider whether our legal system is working for everyone in Ireland and not just the few. So on behalf of everyone at FLAC, thank you, Chief Justice, for your leadership on this issue, and thank you for joining us today for the launch of the annual report. Without any further ado, Chief Justice, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, David, for that kind introduction. Can I say just a few things before getting down to the meat of what I want to say? Firstly, can I echo the comments both of yourself and of Eilish in paying tribute to Peter Ward for his lengthy stewardship of FLAC as its chair. I don't think I can add anything useful to what has already been said, but to say that he leaves FLAC in the kind of position one would like to leave an organisation which one cherishes. I wish you, as the new chair, David, every success. It's a hard act to follow, but I'm sure you will do so. And you did make the point that we've all had to adjust very significantly to doing business in the current climate. A lot of that has made life harder for all of us, though sometimes it does make things a little bit easier. As it happens, I am joining you here from Cork, where I'm sitting for the last time as a High Court judge, hearing cases in the Cork non-jury list, an area which I was involved in setting up many years ago, and where I'm been given a last chance to deal with live cases with witnesses and real lawyers standing in front of me rather than appearing on a screen. And it is perhaps an indication of the way some elements of what we've learned to do over the last 15, 16 months may well form a part of the way we work in the future. If this was a live event in Dublin, I wouldn't be able to be with you all, much as I would like to be, but I can join you in much the same way from my hotel room in Cork as I could from anywhere else. But I think there are really 2 points I want to emphasize in launching FLAC's annual report. The first is perhaps fairly obvious. The second is perhaps something for the future. The first is to acknowledge the great difficulty that we have all had, but I suspect FLAC has had more than most in being able to continue to provide the sort of services we have provided in the past in current conditions. I suppose for those who are very well resourced, there was immediate access to platforms and ways of doing work, which allowed a reasonable approximation to the way things have been in the past. But the kind of services that FLAC has pioneered and continues to develop and provide, I would suspect, were much harder to continue in an effective way in this remote working age. The kind of people who need to access FLAC's services are perhaps not always as easily dealt with in a remote setting. And therefore, the fact that FLAC was able to not only continue, but enhance the services which it gives to those who need them so much in these challenging times is, I think, a huge credit to the organization. I remember FLAC in its very early days when, as Eilidh said, it was essentially a volunteer organization of a small number of young lawyers. And I've commented in the past that it was through FLAC, I suppose, the first significant case that I was involved in, Healy and Donoghue, came about. And it is heartening to see an organization which started in that way, developing it in the way in which it has. And long may it continue to do so. But the perhaps more important point I think that we need to now think about is not just access to justice for those who may at least realize that there may be a legal aspect to the solution to their problems, but how do we identify and, more importantly, fulfill the needs of those who may not even know that there may be a legal aspect to what they need to do. The person who, for example, knows that they would really like to go to a solicitor, get legal advice, perhaps legal representation in the courts, if that's the direction things take, but who has a difficulty in being able to afford that, is a very real problem, but at least it's a readily identifiable one. And initiatives that have been started and developed over recent years, I think, make a significant contribution to that. I'm very glad to have seen the involvement of both with FLAC and through the working group that David referred to of the Legal Aid Board. And I very much welcome the fact that there is a government review of our civil legal aid scheme, and I very much hope that that will result in a widening and a deepening of our provision of civil legal aid. We also have the initiatives which FLAC has been very much at the heart of, to encourage a greater pro bono participation on the part of legal practitioners, perhaps something that is being now formalized and extended over what may have been a largely individual decisions made by individual lawyers in the past. And all of those make a valuable contribution to providing legal services, I suppose one might put it this way, to those who know they need them. But I suspect there is out there a much greater need amongst those who may not even understand that there might be a legal solution to their difficulties. In particular, those who may not be at the heart of Irish society, perhaps many of the new Irish, perhaps those who are otherwise marginalized, may not always fully appreciate that there may be a legal route which can be adopted, which might ultimately improve their situation, perhaps provide a solution, or at least go some way towards ameliorating whatever difficulties they may encounter. There are those who may not even think of the courts as a way in which their rights might be vindicated or their issues might be resolved. Those who perhaps come from cultures where that mightn't be something that you would necessarily think of as an adequate solution. And I think, therefore, there is a need which is sometimes referred to as unmet needs, but perhaps it's even more than that. It's unidentified needs, which needs to be one of our focuses of our actions in the future. It's perhaps interesting that the way in which we're developing the conference, which you spoke of, David, is in two halves. The first half will be a focus on what one might call traditional access to justice issues. How do we provide better legal aid, better pro bono? How do we, as you yourself mentioned, how do we develop our court systems to make them more accessible, less expensive? How do we allow those who know they have a legal issue to be able to effectively interact with our justice system in a way that gives them an equal shout, and in a way which ensures that if they have a legal remedy or a legal entitlement, it can be vindicated and enforced. And that is a very important part of the process. And I don't want, by emphasizing the second half, to in any way minimize the importance of ensuring that we provide a court system which makes it easier for people to access, that ensures that where their rights can only be effectively vindicated by having legal representation, that is available to them, and which ensures that those who know that they need some element of legal assistance can get it, even though they may not be able to afford it in, as it were, the open market. And I might just take, before leaving that point, the opportunity to acknowledge here publicly the particular contribution of the Law Society and the Bar Council to the work of the Supreme Court through an initiative that I can't claim any credit for. It was established by my predecessor, Susan Denham, but where both professions have now established a panel of lawyers who are willing to give their services free of charge to those who are unrepresented but have obtained leave to appeal to the Supreme Court. I appreciate that's a fairly narrow part of the overall picture, but if you think about it in the context of the new constitutional architecture being in place since the 33rd Amendment to the Constitution, with the Court of Appeal as, in effect, the Court of Final Appeal for most cases, with the Supreme Court only dealing with cases that involve an additional layer of public importance. The fact that those who get to that level can now have effective legal representation, I think has a double benefit. The obvious benefit is that their case will be well presented, and that's why the thanks of us all, I think, go to the professions for providing that assistance. But also from an entirely selfish point of view, from the point of view of the courts, having to decide important issues is so much easier when the case is well presented on all sides. I've always felt that the best way of ensuring a good result, a fair result, but also a legally sound result, and in the context of the kind of cases the Supreme Court is now dealing with, a result which may have importance way beyond the scope of the individual case itself. But the ideal way to do that is to have all sides of the case well argued and decided by what I would like to think are reasonably fair and competent judges. Where you don't have the case evenly argued on both sides, then that creates difficulties for the court. Sometimes courts may even try to bend over backwards for those who may not be represented, but that doesn't necessarily produce a very good result either. So I think that's something that is worth acknowledging. And I think that is, all of this is perhaps a work in progress, ensuring as best we can that those who have those legal needs have them met, irrespective of whether they have the resources to purchase legal services on the market, as it were. But the second aspect, of which will be the second half of the conference, which we're hoping to organize in the autumn, is to try and identify those areas at which I think FLAC is in the forefront, where there are legal services out there to be delivered, but where perhaps the people who need them don't even know that they exist, don't even know that there may be a legal remedy or some level of legal representation or advice that may assist them in their position. And I think that involves a different strand of the access to justice model, as it were. It's a strand which tries perhaps to be proactive in giving information to the public, perhaps directed at the very people who may not understand that there is a legal aspect to their difficulties, that there may be a legal remedy for whatever situation they find themselves in. People who may not understand the legal system at all, people who may have never had access to a lawyer, people who may think that the only time they're likely to come in contact with a court is when they're in trouble or when their friends are in trouble. I think we need to devise much better ways of reaching out to those parts of society that may not even know that there is a legal aspect to their issues. That involves information. It may ultimately involve the traditional provision of assistance that FLAC has been so great at over the last 50-odd years. But there's perhaps a condition precedent to that is being able to identify and inform those who might need those services that there is a legal aspect to their difficulties. I don't think we have worked out all the solutions to that problem as yet, and that's one of the things I would very much like to develop in the second half of the conference, which we're planning. And can I say that Eilish has been of huge benefit on the working group, and I know that FLAC's expertise in this area, particularly in relation to that second aspect, will be of immeasurable benefit to us all. And therefore, perhaps in echoing what has already been said, in thanks to those whose work forms the narrative behind this annual report, to recognize the fact that everyone has had to adapt hugely over the last year, to congratulate those who have managed to do so successfully. We might map out a development in the future so that perhaps in 5 years' time, if we were back here thinking about the same issues, we could say that we had made significant progress, not only in the provision of access to justice to those who know they need it, but perhaps in informing those who may not even know that they need it, that there is a justice solution to their difficulties. So with that being said, like all these things, it's always a work in progress. This annual report shows that it is a work on which progress has been significantly made in very challenging times over the last year. And it only remains for me to formally launch the report, and in doing so to congratulate all of those, whether the staff, the volunteers, the board, who have worked so tirelessly to develop new ways of delivering old services in very challenging times. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Chief Justice, and thank you very much for your kind comments about FLAC and taking the time to launch our annual report. Your comments resonate very strongly with FLAC's experience of trying to provide legal services for disadvantaged people and people living in extreme poverty. And it has been our experience that the greater the disadvantage, the greater the number of matters that might have a legal solution or that might benefit from a legal solution, of which the caller to, for example, their own Roma clinic may well be unaware. And even solving one of the legal aspects of a person's circumstances might have a disproportionately positive impact on the rest of their circumstances. So thank you very much. I also want to thank you for the initiative, the Access to Justice initiative, and FLAC is very happy to participate in it, and we look forward to continuing to participate in it, and also to engage in consultation about the modernisation of the court services and the family justice system. And you mentioned the legal aid review, and I'll speak some more about that later. So thank you, Chief Justice. The impact of COVID-19, as has been said already, dominated all of FLAC's work last year. Our network of legal advice clinics, which normally see about 14,000 people per annum, had to close due to government restrictions. And like David, I want to thank all the individuals and organisations that contacted us immediately to see if they could be of help. The whole staff, with invaluable essential help from volunteers, pivoted the work of the organisation to ensure, insofar as we could, that people would continue to have access to legal information and advice. And within 17 days of the move to work from home, we'd established phone advice clinics, a move we'd been planning to do for some time, but the pandemic forced us to do it. And over 100 barristers and solicitors immediately volunteered to provide advice at these phone clinics. The telephone line felt the brunt of the pandemic, with all the face-to-face clinics closed. And the reality was, and still remains in 2021, that the telephone information line is the first and sadly maybe the last port of call for some people. And there's huge unprecedented demand on the phone line. And this, I think, shows the importance and need of basic legal information and advice. And again, would echo what the Chief Justice said about the need for legal information and advice targeted at people who may not know that their problems would benefit from a legal analysis and solution. Before the pandemic, we had noticed an increase in the number of employment law queries. And during COVID, employment law queries rose by 39%. And during 1 week in May, exceeded family law queries for the first time in FLAC's history. It is a matter of ongoing concern that there's no legal aid available in employment cases. There is a view about that there's no need for legal aid in employment law cases, and that the Workplace Relations Commission is an accessible forum and should not be overly legal. The employment law queries that presented to FLAC's phone line during COVID were complex and difficult, and very often beyond the capacity of our experienced phone line staff to deal with, and we regularly, and still do, have to obtain advice from employment law specialists on the issues that we're presenting on the phone line. And the Supreme Court judgment in Zalewski has added to the complexity of bringing cases before the WRC. Nearly 2,000 people managed to get through to the phone line with employment law queries, which we suspect is only a fraction of the demand that is there, as our phone line was ringing all the time. And for a large percentage of the callers with employment law queries, there is simply nowhere to send them to get further legal aid once they've talked to people on our phone line and attended our phone advice clinics. And this is a real cause of concern. Family law queries also rose by 14%, and given the very restricted means test and delays in getting legal aid, a significant proportion of the 3,435 people that contacted us with family law queries will remain without legal representation for issues such as maintenance, custody, and divorce. And many callers to the phone line were waiting for long periods for assessment and approval of legal aid. And often they were contacting FLAC to find out information on how best simply to adjourn their case till they'd get legal aid. We're also seeing a growing number of people trying to represent themselves in family law cases, and over half of the queries from lay litigants had a family law issue. 420 callers had a query which included domestic violence, and in the phone clinics between March and December, FLAC referred 48 callers to the Gardaí, 12 of which related to domestic violence. The Still Here campaign was launched during COVID to assure victims of domestic violence that help from the guards and the Legal Aid Board was available during COVID. And it beggars belief that 3,100 emergency calls made by domestic violence victims were cancelled between 2019 and last October, covering some of the worst periods of the pandemic and the lockdown. It almost goes without saying that where a person reports domestic violence to a state authority, human rights laws obliges that the report be investigated and reasonable steps be taken to protect people from any harm, either directly from violence or from witnessing the violence. And FLAC, along with the NWCI, ICCL and some domestic violence groups, have called for an independent review of the cancelled emergency calls. In 2020, 210 social justice NGOs received legal assistance through our PELA's pro bono referral scheme, which was a 40% increase, illustrating the difficulties that the NGOs were struggling with during the pandemic. We're very pleased to have been associated with the development of the Proponent Pledge, which the Chief Justice mentioned, which was launched last year. This is a new initiative which asks the members of the legal profession to commit to a target of 20 pro bono hours per year. And the pledge is supported by the Bar, the Law Society and the Dublin Solicitors Bar Association, and has over 100 signatories representing more than 2,500 solicitors and barristers. FLAC works to provide and highlight the needs for appropriate legal services for people living in poverty and disadvantage, as we've pointed out before. As an independent law centre, housing, social welfare and discrimination were the main areas of law where FLAC provided legal representation, and a number of significant outcomes were achieved, which Chris will highlight later on. We're really proud to have been involved in the establishment of the Traveller Legal Service with the assistance of the Community Foundation for Ireland and with the steering group of national traveller organisations, which I think provides an excellent model for legal services, the type of legal services that the Chief Justice was talking about. The level of demand on its services points to acute and urgent need for a more fully resourced traveller legal service to be established. And we've also been working with the Legal Aid Board in relation to the provision of services for travellers. The ongoing work of the Roma Clinic proved difficult during the pandemic, given the particular vulnerabilities of that community. And I think that the Roma community, based on our experience in the FLAC clinic, is one of those communities that the Chief Justice was talking about and referring to, where basic information and advocacy is absolutely essential. And Chris will deal with the work of that clinic later. The extent of unmet legal need we encounter on the phone, in the clinics, in the Traveller Legal Service and the Roma Clinic all point to the need for a much better resourced legal aid system, which has the flexibility and capacity and know-how to reach people living in disadvantage and poverty. We've been campaigning for some time for a root and branch review of the civil legal aid system. And with our Right to Justice campaign in 2020, we sought to make reform of civil legal aid a key issue in the general election. And we're delighted that the Department of Justice has committed to carrying out a review later this year. We hope it will be comprehensive. We hope it will be independent. We hope it will involve external stakeholders who have experience of dealing with people living in extreme poverty and disadvantage and providing legal service to them. And we hope it will be equivalent to the original Pringle report, which was chaired by an independent judge. We made detailed submissions to the Oireachtas Special Committee on COVID-19 last year, highlighting that rights and access to justice are even more important in a pandemic, and in particular, the legal needs of vulnerable and disadvantaged individuals, and the upcoming review of the Equality Code and legal aid system must address these issues. While welcoming the move to online courts, we express concerns that it's only a partial solution and may be unsuitable for certain cases, people with literacy, language and certain health issues, and that the digital divide needs to be tackled, and that resources need to be dedicated to proactively identifying parties who may be vulnerable and ensuring that accommodations are made to be able to enable them to participate fully. FLAC's policy work and casework highlight the important role that we in civil society play in a democratic society by holding the state to account. And it is vital that the proposed reform of the judicial review system, as suggested in the review of the administration of justice, will not be implemented if the state is continued to be held to account. I work with a fantastic bunch of people, and as David said, each and every one of them worked their hardest to ensure that FLAC would be able to continue to provide legal information and advice. It was an extraordinarily difficult year for staff, involving the move to work safely from home, the establishment of the phone advice clinics, the unprecedented pressure on the information line, and the safe return back to work of the litigation team. If I named anyone, I'd have to name every member of staff. So I just wanted to say thank you. It's a privilege working with such passionate, committed people. I now want to invite Chris Bowes to provide more detail in relation to the casework and the policy arising from it. And I wanted to get it on the record that Chris has promised to do a dance at the start of the next annual report to celebrate the end of the pandemic. So we're going to hold him to that. Chris.
Thanks, Eilish. I am already rehearsing and I'm really looking forward to that. So as Eilish said, I'm going to speak somewhat about FLAC's, the casework FLAC undertook during 2020 as an independent law centre. And I'm also going to touch on the campaigning and policy work that FLAC undertook as an independent human rights organisation, because during 2020 there was something of an overlap between those two functions that FLAC undertakes. So as Eilish said, FLAC had 102 active case files during 2020, and Eilish has already referenced our Traveller Legal Service and our Roma Legal Clinic, and most of those case files arose from those two services. However, there is some other casework outcomes noted in the annual report beyond those two services, and I think a good example is the outcome in the Court of Justice's decision in the Data Protection Commission and Facebook and Schrems, which is noted early on in the litigation section of the report. As with previous years, the casework undertaken by FLAC was dominated by three areas, which were housing, equality, and social welfare. So I might turn first to housing. And it's perhaps unsurprising that the work of the Traveller Legal Service from the very earliest stage and FLAC's previous work on behalf of the Traveller community has been predominantly related to housing issues. So during 2020 alone, FLAC opened 4 new case files in relation to traveller-specific accommodation and a further 4 files then in relation to standards and traveller-specific accommodation. And there was also another 3 files then in relation on behalf of travellers who were subject to eviction proceedings even during 2020 and during the pandemic. Eilish has already spoke about the important role of judicial review, and during 2020 on the housing side, FLAC was involved in 9 judicial review cases, and of those 9 cases during 2020, 7 settled in favour of FLAC's clients. Another one is still outstanding, and then one was decided in favour of FLAC's client, and that's one I might turn to now. That was in relation to the Housing Circular 41/2012 from the Department of Housing, and that was a file on behalf of a homeless Roma couple, and it was one of 5 files FLAC opened, or that was active for the FLAC team during 2020 in relation to Roma families whose access to social housing was impeded by that circular, which excludes certain EU nationals from accessing social housing supports. So in the annual report, we note the successful outcome in H and South Dublin County Council, and that case related to the refusal of the council to assess our client's housing application within the statutory timeframe. And the important judgment of Mr. Justice McGrath in the High Court underscores that all social housing applications must be decided upon within the statutory 12-week timeframe. And I think I might highlight now that there's a blog on FLAC's new legal blog, the FLAC Casebook, which has more details on those 5 cases in relation to the housing circular, which FLAC took on behalf of Roma families during 2020. In each of those cases, FLAC's client was eventually added to the housing list on foot of FLAC's intervention in those cases. Turning then to the equality side of things, I think people have heard a lot about equality from FLAC over the month of June, but I think the annual report underscores many of the important issues which FLAC raised during our seminar series Status Check, which was run throughout June in relation to the Equal Status Act. And you'll see in the equality section of the report, there's a successful outcome in a case on behalf of a Roma woman in relation to discrimination in access to services and harassment against a shopping centre and security firm. That case settled in favour of FLAC's client. And I think that case illustrates the intersectional discrimination that Roma women often face, which FLAC has previously highlighted. And as was noted repeatedly during the Status Check series on equality law, intersectional discrimination is not something which is dealt with fully under Ireland's existing equality code. Another matter, I think the extent of the equality outcome section in the annual report speaks to the huge unmet legal need in relation to discrimination and equality matters in Ireland, particularly among groups such as Traveller and Roma. And I think it underscores the need for legal aid for equality claims before the WRC. And I think anyone who attended the status check series should take a look at the equality section of the report, which I think really illustrates a lot of the issues that were raised throughout that series. Turning then, as I said, the other area in which FLAC's casework related to largely during 2020 was social welfare casework. And again, in the social welfare casework section of the report, there's another example of a barrier which Roma in Ireland face in seeking to access public services to which they are entitled. That barrier, which is referenced there, is the habitual residence condition, which is a condition for access to certain social welfare payments. And there's a number of outcomes illustrated or noted in the report of casework FLAC took on behalf of Roma who were unable to access social welfare on the basis of that condition. One outcome that's noted is cases FLAC took on behalf of 2 Roma women who were unable to who had been resident in the state for over 10 years and who were unable to access social welfare on the basis that of a finding that they were not habitually resident in the state. And in both cases, FLAC sought a review of those decisions, and both women were awarded child benefit in respect of their families with significant back payments of the payment awarded in each case. So as I noted, that's another example, such as the housing circular, of a barrier to Roma in Ireland accessing public services like housing and like social welfare. Another significant aspect of the social welfare work undertaken by FLAC during 2020 was our campaigning work around the administration of social welfare payments during the pandemic. Obviously, that was a time when more people than ever were dependent on social welfare payments to provide some basic income. And FLAC campaigned throughout the year to ensure that those social welfare payments which people were dependent on were administered in a fair and transparent manner and in accordance with the law. So the first point I might illustrate is that in June 2020, FLAC issued a response to a social welfare circular that had been issued by the Department of Social Protection in relation to entitlement to social welfare during absences from the state. And that circular purported to suspend the rules provided for in legislation and regulations in relation to entitlement to certain social welfare payments while people were absent from the state for periods up to 2 weeks. FLAC highlighted at that time that a circular could not suspend the valid provisions of legislation, and that circular also set out that people could not be considered available for work during the 2 weeks after they had spent time abroad on the basis that they weren't available for work during that period. And that was something else that FLAC noted was contrary to the regulations in relation to that condition. And as well as our campaigning work, FLAC also undertook casework in this issue. And the report notes a successful social welfare appeal FLAC took on behalf of a client whose payment was cut off while she was absent from the state. That was a job seeker's benefit payment, and also during the 2 weeks after her return. And the outcome in that social welfare appeal, the appeals officer accepted FLAC's submission that the regulations still allowed for payment during those periods and could not be suspended by way of an administrative circular. So FLAC's case or policy work in relation to social welfare during this period largely began in response to the public outcry over the actions of the Department of Social Protection at ports and airports. And FLAC also issued a policy response to those actions, noting that there was no legal basis for the Department of Social Protection to undertake blanket social welfare checks at airports for people boarding certain flights. And it's interesting to note that FLAC's legal view on that matter was informed by a social welfare case undertaken by FLAC before the pandemic on behalf of a caller to the Roma Legal Clinic. And it's notable that after FLAC's intervention in that matter, the department has stopped engaging in airport checks. And the report also notes that FLAC acted on behalf of a woman who was subject to an airport check She was in receipt of the COVID PUP and she was traveling abroad to care for her mother who was critically ill. Her payment was suspended on foot of an airport check and wasn't restored. She returned to work by the time she was acting for FLAC, but FLAC acted on behalf of that woman, and we issued, as well as corresponding with the department, we issued a notification under the Equal Status Acts against the department, and the action FLAC took on behalf of that woman settled on confidential terms. And then FLAC has highlighted these issues in a submission to the Oireachtas COVID-19 Response Committee and in a subsequent submission to the Oireachtas Social Protection Committee. And in both those submissions, we also highlighted as a matter of concern the imposition of a requirement to genuinely seek work while in receipt of the PUP. This was something we noted, and in the beginning we noted that there was no legislative basis for that. When it was put on a legislative basis, we noted the unfairness of it given the nature of the PUP payment as a payment for those who were temporarily laid off from their employment due to COVID-19 and the restrictions that were imposed as a result. And in December 2020, regulations were introduced which effectively removed that condition, which was a significant outcome from FLAC's campaigning work in that regard. And just the final thing to note is that FLAC also highlighted the absence of a legal basis for the exclusion of those living in direct provision from access to the COVID PUP for a significant period of time until August 2020. And even after that policy was reversed, there was a lack of clarity as to how those in direct provision could access the arrears of the payment which they were owed during the period for which they were excluded from the payment. And FLAC acted for a woman who had been excluded from the payment during the period she was laid off from March 2020, and following correspondence from FLAC, she was awarded €7,000 in arrears of the payment. So there's just 2 points I want to note in relation to FLAC's work in this regard. The first is that it illustrates issues that were highlighted by IREC and the TCD COVID-19 Human Rights Observatory in relation to the blurring of lines between law and advice during the pandemic. That's in relation to the social welfare conditions and how they were changed without a legal basis. And I think that's a very concrete example and a concerning one of that blurring of lines, given the importance of social welfare from a human rights perspective during a period such as the pandemic. But for FLAC, they also illustrate how our casework can inform our policy work and vice versa, and the value in FLAC's litigation, not just for individual clients, but in a broader sense, in that the policy learnings and the outcomes in those cases can have a broader implication. And it's an example of how FLAC can use those outcomes to good effect. And I've already noted that there's blogs posted on the FLAC casebook, our legal blog, which we launched during 2020. And that's a place where we hope to continue to capture the outcomes from our casework. And I hope people will follow that blog. So I'll hand it back to Eilish now.
Thank you so much, Chris. As we've said a number of times already, the phone line bore the brunt of the pandemic and provided a real snapshot into what was going on in people's lives. And I now ask Erin, our phone line development manager, to tell us about the calls to the phone line during 2020. Erin.
Good morning. The FLAC information line was at the forefront of providing legal information and assistance in 2020, and no more so than when the COVID restrictions commenced. The closing of FLAC's face-to-face drop-in legal clinics meant that the demand for our information line service rose significantly. In 2020, FLAC received 12,468 calls to its information and referral line. This was almost identical to the number of calls received the previous year, despite the reduction in opening hours and the provision of more detailed information. The telephone information line saw a significant demand for our services arising directly from the challenges faced by service users due to the COVID restrictions implemented. These restrictions to people's movement, as well as business closures, often caused overnight changes to people's employment status, earnings, and increased family tensions when spouses and partners had to reside together for longer periods of time than in the past. As a result, the information and referral line saw significant increases in queries relating to employment and family law. In 2020, the telephone information and referral line dealt with more complex queries, often related to the restrictions arising from the COVID pandemic, particularly in the areas of employment and family law. Employment law queries comprise 16% of our queries, an increase of 38.6% compared to 2019. And family law queries comprised 27.6% of the queries raised, an increase of 14.2% compared to the previous year. Civil queries to the telephone information and referral line comprised 8.1% of the queries raised, an 18.7% increase compared to 2019. Consumer queries comprised 4.6% of the queries raised to the information line, an increase of 45% compared to 2019. This increase is directly related to the effect of COVID restrictions on consumers' flight and wedding reception bookings and the changes to consumer agreements generally arising from COVID restrictions, including building agreements for house purchases and buildings. In May 2020, we saw for the first time the employment law queries exceeded family law queries, a situation not seen prior to then. The telephone and information line received calls from people who were the subject of ongoing and exacerbated domestic violence and felt in genuine fear for their safety. And often the telephone information and referral line was their only avenue of communication and source of information and advice. This was often due to the financial and alcohol stresses, as well as people now living in close confines due to the overnight loss of employment arising from COVID restrictions. The pressures arising from the COVID pandemic restrictions often exacerbated already very difficult family and marital situations. It is clear to see the resulting marital breakdowns that arose in the volume of legal aid referrals by the information line, seeking separation advice over divorce advice legal representation. We received calls from people seeking separation family law advice, where often COVID restrictions were in effect the straw that broke the camel's back, where hitherto couples had cohabited in relative harmony. Many family law calls started with, my marriage or relationship has broken down due to COVID. Where do I start legally? When faced with the loss of employment, residing together for months on end, and with a significant reduction in income, many people contacting the telephone information and referral line for family law information had decided to legally end their marriage, and were often at a loss as to where to start. This is reflected in how many callers sought information on separation as opposed to divorce. 38.5% of family law queries related to separation or divorce in 2020. The telephone information and referral line received calls from people who were no longer in receipt of child maintenance due to the loss of employment by the paying parent, often which was combined with the loss of employment by the primary carer. Many callers raising maintenance queries and seeking information were in dire financial straits. 17.5% of family law queries related to maintenance. The telephone information and referral line received calls from many fathers who, due to COVID restrictions, were facing difficulties in having access to their children and did not know where to turn to seek information and advice. This was particularly so where they could not afford to seek private legal advice. 28.1% of family law queries related to access, guardianship or custody. There were many callers to the telephone information and referral line who were waiting long periods for the assessment and approval of their legal aid applications, while at the same time attending court to seek adjournments to proceedings that they had been served with. Service users would often contact the telephone information and referral line wondering how to communicate the request for an adjournment to the court until their legal aid applications had been assessed and approved. This was often also the case with callers who were in highly vulnerable positions, seeking domestic violence or maintenance orders in the context of separation or divorce proceedings. The rise in employment law queries, in particular to the COVID pandemic, reflected the overnight change in people's employment status. In the blink of an eye, employees were put on short-term layoff and faced significant financial pressure to adhere to ongoing financial commitments, but now from a far smaller income. The information line received an increased volume of redundancy queries, as people were often caught between indefinite layoff but not being made redundant. We also received queries where contract terms were unilaterally changed by employers to facilitate changed salaries or change working hours on the return to employment. We received queries where people were being asked to return to employment part-time, but where a part-time salary would be less than the pandemic social welfare payment. And if the request was refused, callers were threatened with dismissal. These are only some of the examples of the varied and pandemic-related queries that the telephone line received and responded to. It was and is clear to see the significant effects that the sudden loss of employment and the reduction in income has across all aspects of people's lives. This is at a time when people most need legal information and advice but can least afford it. It is also clear to see from the queries received by the information line the often detrimental effect that the loss of employment and the deterioration in marital or cohabiting relationships had on callers' mental health. Service users who contact us were often very distressed, despondent, anxious, scared, and stressed as to what they perceived to be obstacles at every turn and their inability to obtain affordable legal information and advice. The telephone information line witnessed firsthand also the significant stress experienced by callers who did not qualify for legal aid to commence a separation or divorce proceedings, but whose income could not afford private legal advice, particularly in situations where a matter may be contested. Lay litigants to the telephone information and referral line were often single-handedly drafting their own pleadings and attending court hearings with no experience of what to expect. 54.4% of lay litigant queries related to family law matters. The telephone information and referral line users received practical legal information from our staff and volunteers. Service users benefited hugely from the specialist volunteer legal clinics that provided service users with advice and assistance, without which callers to the telephone information line would otherwise be navigating a totally unfamiliar legal system. 18% of all queries received by the telephone information and referral line were referred on to telephone specialist legal advice clinics. Given the continuation of restrictions in 2021, we anticipate that the high demand for legal information and assistance and advice will continue. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Erin. When Susan showed me the video of FLAC Speaks performing the piece Still, it resonated with the experience of the callers to the phone line as has been described so well there by Erin. And given the extraordinary year that was 2020, I wanted to pay tribute to the callers who contacted FLAC and placed their trust in FLAC, and the staff and volunteers who have done their very best to help them access legal advice. And I'll leave the last word to FLAC Speaks. But before I do that, I want to thank the dynamic trio of Caroline, Susan and Chris for organising the annual report and this event, Chris and Erin for speaking, Tom and IT and Michael Feeney, the sign language interpreter, and the Chief Justice for attending and launching this report, which is greatly appreciated. FLAC Speaks is a Nigerian-Irish poet, performer, playwright from County Longford. She's been nominated Best Performer by the Dublin Fringe Festival in September 2018 for her performance in Boy Child. As well as being a member of the Poetry Ireland Board of Directors, she's a member of the poetry collective We Are Riot. Her poem, For Our Mothers, is in the Leaving Cert curriculum for the examination year 2023. I leave the last word to her and thank her in advance. FLAC Speaks.
Thank you so much, Ailish. It's been incredible to listen in and to just soak in all the information for the event and the launch. Thank you so much for all the work that you do. Thank you so much for inviting me. It is such a pleasure. And my piece Still goes like this. Still, COVID came and Ireland stood still, shocked at how much could gather at our doorsteps like dust. We wrestled what we might, what we may, how life would continue and the ways it must. Stood still. The virus ate through limbs of every family tree. It choked out the lives we built roots around. It emptied out purses, cutting money by the foot, rendered hearts bruised and persons forgotten, left us breathless for dead. Still, we closed into ourselves. We folded behind lock and key, inhaled through the fogs of uncertainty. We found fun in the walls of our homes, made it work, fashioned it for play, carved out sections to fill joy with, so we can hold it firm on the days we didn't know what was next, what could happen. Still, for those whom age had known beyond a golden jubilee, whose eyes glazed with film real memories, whose daughters have vowed to love them in their sunset, whose sons have kissed them in their sunrise, We want your vision of us in full color. Stood still. For emerging minds that must dare to dream in high definition. For lonely minds glaring at love through a screen. For bodies that create homes in cardboard shelters. Still, for you, Ireland is standing still. But tomorrow, when our knees grow soft with impatience and the gates of our homes swing open, which way would our legs go? Which path does our heart know? Thank you.